In the last section of Chapter 4 here, we're going to talk about some more biology-flavored topics as we continue talking about things that are related to evolution and genetics, but we're going to cover things like parental investment, altruism, and then we're going to get into aggression towards the end. But let's start off with parental investment. And the first thing we need to understand is that there are a lot of resources that are put into successfully raising each offspring. These resources can be things like time, the actual effort and energy that are associated, but even the risk, where parents run the risk of themselves being injured while caring for their offspring. And there tend to be two sort of broad approaches to parental investment. Humans and other species who have the same approach as we do tend to invest a lot of those resources into a small number of offspring. In biology, this would be called a K-selected approach to parental investment. So humans, a couple of species of birds, elephants are good examples of this, where they have very few offspring at a time, sometimes as few as one, but they will put lots of effort into feeding and caring for and raising that one offspring in order to give that one or small number of offspring the best chance that they can at surviving to reproduce. The other side of the spectrum will see species like mice and other rodents who will produce large numbers of offspring and offer very little care to them. This would be called an R-selected approach, where they produce lots and lots of offspring and give them little to no care or resources in the hopes that out of the large group of offspring produced, at least some will manage to survive to maturity to pass on their genes. So rodents, a lot of fish go with this approach, just sort of leave your eggs and hope for the best, or produce lots of offspring and have them be ready to exist in the world fairly early, and you just sort of hope that a lot of them survive. And in both scenarios, theoretically, if you're successful, at least some of your offspring will survive, reproduce, and pass on your genes. In this process, for those species that do have some kind of parental investment, where the parents will put some sort of effort and resources into raising those offspring, the parents don't necessarily invest equally. And we will start seeing sex differences in parental investment. And one way of explaining these sex differences in investment falls under the system or the mating systems that were proposed by Trivers back in the 70s. And so we're going to talk about his proposed mating systems over the next couple of slides. And so the basic rules for these mating systems, when we're looking at parental investment, is that there will be competition for the sex that makes the highest parental investment. Usually the highest parental investment is going to be made by the female. So females have to do all of the effort of laying eggs if they're a species that lay eggs, or in, say, humans, where you have to carry a baby to term. That's a lot of time and effort and resources that you're putting into that offspring. So that's a very high parental investment. So usually in most systems, you're going to see a lot of competition where males will compete to access the females because the females put the most resources into their offspring. So they invest the most as a parent. On the other side of things, that sex that has the highest investment, so again, mostly females, they're usually going to be very picky in selecting a mate. So the idea is if you're spending a lot of time and effort and resources in producing an offspring, you're going to want to have that offspring with the ideal mate, with the most promising mate that you can find. So if we think about this in terms of genes, you'd be looking for a mate that has the best genetic material because they're going to be giving 50% of their genetic material to your offspring. So you want your offspring to have the best chance of survival, so you're going to find a mate that gives them the best genetic material that will give them the best chance of survival. So that's sort of the logic behind these mating systems. And if we look at different contributions from both sexes, from both parents, we can see we're going to talk about 4 distinct types of mating systems. So we'll start with monogamous, and monogamous is one of the easiest systems to break down. And so you will see a monogamous system when both parents have equal parental investment. So the male and the female both invest equally in raising their offspring. In systems like this, you're going to have one male and one female, and they will bond and pair together, sometimes long term. In species that show monogamy, you're going to see very little sexual dimorphism between the sexes. And what this means is that there isn't a visual difference between the two sexes. So I'll use birds as an example because that's what I'm most familiar with. But if you've ever seen black-capped chickadees, they all look the same. They aren't like, say, cardinals, where the male is bright red and the female is sort of a dull brown. So cardinals have a strong sexual dimorphism. Chickadees, on the other hand, the males and the females are both sort of black heads, white bellies, and brownish-gray backs, and that's it. So that little amount of sexual dimorphism tells us that chickadees are probably monogamous. And in fact, they are. A male and a female will mate, and they will both work together to raise their offspring. This usually happens in situations where one parent couldn't successfully rear their young. So in the case of black-capped chickadees, they need the effort of both the mother and the father bringing food to the offspring to successfully raise them. So this happens in a lot of species where you need both parents to successfully raise the young. Our next couple of mating systems fall under the umbrella of polygamy. So polygamous mating systems evolve because of unequal contributions, and the different types will depend on what those contributions are. So the first of our polygamous systems is called polyandry. Poly meaning many, and andry meaning males. So in this system, you have one female and many males. So in this case, this one female would like to mate with as many males as possible to increase her odds of finding a good mate. So the females will try and compete among each other so that she can have access to this male and that male and that male. And in this case, the male would choose if they want the female to mate with them. This is a weird mating system. It's fairly rare in mammals, so we almost never see it in mammals, but it's rather common in fish and insects and some species of birds. In this case, we would say that the females are competing. They're competing amongst each other for access to the males, so the males must be putting more investment in their offspring. So this would be the case if the male were the ones raising the offspring, say from the nest. And so the males get to be picky because they have to invest all of that effort in raising the offspring. So, like I said, this is an atypical one that we don't see a lot of, but is fairly common in fish and insects, which not as many people study, which is unfortunate. Our next system is polygyny, where you have one male mating with many females. And this is a much more common one. So this male would like to have access to as many females as possible because the more females he mates with, the more of his genetic material he's going to pass along. So males will compete among each other for access to those females. And in turn, the females can choose to be picky about who they allow to mate with them. So this one is a lot more common. You'll see this in lots of mammals, lots of bird species. So this is the usual mating, or the usual polygamous mating system that you'll encounter. And the last polygamous system is actually a weird one, and it's called polygynandry. So you have many males and many females. You'll also sometimes see this called promiscuity, but it's basically there is no real system. It's males will mate with any females they can find, females mate with any males they can find. And this usually happens when neither parent invests a whole lot in the offspring. So this could be species that lay eggs and just leave them there to be fertilized by whichever males are around. So some fish species. So this one's a little bit weird, and it doesn't have the same choosiness and competition that you see with the other systems. But those are the main 4 mating systems that tend to arise based on parental investment, and specifically unequal parental investment. Now, this next section is a weird one because we're starting to try and take these sort of very biology-heavy ideas and we're starting to try and apply them to humans. And that tends to cause quite a bit of controversy when it happens, because a lot of people like to keep humans separate from other non-human animals. But as animals ourselves, a lot of these same principles sort of carry over into a lot of the behaviors that we see today. So keep in mind that I'm approaching these things from the biology side of things, where I'm looking at sort of our environment that we evolved in and the different systems that exist underneath all of the different behaviors that we see today. So this is a very biology focus when looking at mate preference specifically in humans. So just my little disclaimer before this section, because this is a weird one in the textbook. But when we talk about mate preference, the different sexes tend to have different preferences on average overall when they're looking for a desirable mate. Males tend to focus on physical attractiveness and health. And this is for a sort of less selfish reason than people in society tend to assume. There's actually a biological reason to prefer physical attractiveness. And that's because when we're growing and developing, if we grow up in an environment that has lots of resources, if we grow up in a rich environment, then our bodies tend to grow in a symmetrical fashion. We tend to have fewer flaws. And our brains are sort of hardwired to perceive that symmetricalness, that unflawed appearance as attractive, because it's actually an indicator of both good genes and having grown up in a good environment. So these physical cues that we're picking up on are actually an interpretation of our underlying genetic structure and some of our internal systems as well. So just to put that out there. So men are going to be looking for sort of physical attractiveness and health, specifically because from a biology point of view, they're looking for a good mate who will be able to produce and raise healthy offspring. So they're looking for that genetic solidness that will help produce good offspring. In turn, females tend to focus on things like earning potential, status, and ambition, and those are all indicators of ability to provide, basically being a good mate in that they would support the female in raising their young. So putting the biology spin on all of this. And both are going to be looking for some kind of mutual attraction, dependability, and emotional stability. Things that are going to make a good mate, someone they're going to want to stay with while they raise their children, and someone that they can rely on. So it kind of makes sense. And so if we break this down even further, we've already talked about the symmetrical face as being an indicator of good genes and a good raising environment. Men are also looking for youth and health, specifically because younger women tend to fare better during childbirth. So they're going to prefer a mate who is younger, who would be able to better produce healthy offspring. Again, from the biology perspective. Women, in turn, would be looking for an older man because the male's age is a little bit less of an indicator of the success of an offspring. So women would be looking for the other things that come with being older, things like financial stability, which would help give them a more secure environment in which to raise their young. And so they're looking for that ability to provide a stable environment and the ability to invest in raising their offspring. There's also some studies that show women are looking for a symmetrical face, but again, as an indicator for good genes that they could then pass on to their offspring. Now, there are tons of studies that go into these kinds of preferences and what mates are looking for within humans, and it's a very interesting piece of literature. So if you have some time, that might be an interesting place to go looking, but just be prepared for some drama. And that's why I keep it fairly short in these lectures. From there, we're going to move on to actually one of my favorite parts of this chapter, and this is where we get to talk about altruism and cooperation. Now, cooperation is just when one individual helps another and gains some sort of advantage. So if there are two, what do I always use? I have prairie dogs. If you have two prairie dogs and they're going to work together to drag some food back to their burrow, then they're helping each other out. And by doing so, they both get access to that food. So they cooperate to achieve that goal. That is not uncommon to see in the animal kingdom, working together and both benefiting from it. All of the models of evolution and natural selection say that that's something that can evolve in terms of behavior because there's a benefit to it. The problem that we run into is the existence of something called altruism. And altruism is a situation in which one individual helps another, but there are costs involved. So instead of just benefiting from that help, the individual that does the helping ends up suffering some kind of consequence. So if we go back to our groundhogs, you can think of their alarm behavior, where one will stand up and make an alarm call to warn the rest of the colony about an approaching predator. The problem here is that the individual who produces the alarm call is putting themselves at risk to help the rest of the colony. So by standing up and making loud noises to warn of a predator, they're drawing the predator's attention to themselves. So they're helping everyone else, but putting themselves at risk. And according to all of our models of natural selection, that kind of behavior, that act of putting yourself at risk, shouldn't evolve. It shouldn't happen because you're making it less likely that you're going to survive by doing that act. So altruism shouldn't really be a thing according to how we understand natural selection. And yet, we see altruism in a lot of different species in a lot of different situations. It's not completely ubiquitous, it's not everywhere, but it's in enough places to make us think about it. And so, of course, evolution individuals, people who study evolution, were very bothered by this. And so they came up with a couple of different theories to try and explain it. And we're going to talk about two major ones. One being the kin selection theory and the other the reciprocal altruism theory. And so the kin selection theory basically says that by drawing that attention to yourself, you're actually allowing your relatives the chance to survive. So by doing that altruistic act, you yourself may not survive, but your close relatives who also share your genetic material have an increased chance of survival. So the groundhog that's making the alarm call is allowing their children and their children's children to survive by making that alarm call, so the genes aren't removed from the population, so it would be allowed to continue. And that's all well and good. If this were true, we actually have a couple of hypotheses that we could test. So let's hop to the next slide, where if kin selection theory were true, we would expect to see a positive correlation between degree of relatedness and how often that helping behavior, those altruistic acts, are displayed. So you would expect to see more altruistic acts towards individuals that are more related to them. And in fact, when they've studied this, specifically this one was looking at humans, but they've looked at this in a couple of different species, and the graph is showing genetic relatedness and percent helping. So more altruism, the higher you are on this axis, and more related over on this left side. And we see that for individuals that are 0.5 genetic relatedness, so people like sisters or brothers or parents, you see much higher acts of altruism. And as that drops, when you get down to a 0.25, so that would be something like cousins, you're seeing less helping. And as you get further away than that, you see even less helping. So there is some evidence that you'll see more altruistic acts towards more closely related individuals. So the kin selection theory seems to be fairly sound. All right, well, what about the second theory? What about this reciprocal altruism theory? This is the idea that altruism is contributing to long-term cooperation. So the individual who's helping is put out right now, so they're not getting anything out of it presently, but this is setting up a back and forth system where in the future you will help me. The idea of I help you now, you help me later. And so we can hop to this slide where we have our predictions, our hypotheses. So if this were true, we should see that individuals would be able to remember who has and hasn't helped in the past. And we would see that they would be more likely to help individuals that have helped in the past and more likely to ignore individuals that didn't help in the past. So this requires a couple of more steps where species need to be able to remember individuals. But if you look at species like a lot of corvids, things like crows and ravens, where they can remember individuals, you do start seeing this pattern where they remember those who are helpful and continue that helpful behavior towards the helpers, and they'll ignore those that don't help. So we get a little bit of evidence that supports both our reciprocal altruism theory and our kin selection theory. So it's not so much that one is right and one is wrong, it's that both seem to have some kind of truth to them, but they might not be the full picture. All right, and then for the very end of this chapter, we're going to talk very, very briefly about aggression. And again, we talk about it because this is something that seems a little bit counterintuitive when we think about it in terms of how we understand natural selection. So if we think about aggression, the act of being aggressive, of getting in fights and being out and causing conflict actually puts yourself at risk. So it seems strange that aggression should be a behavior that has evolved and that gets maintained in populations. But the benefits of aggression might actually outweigh some of the negatives that come along with it. So by being aggressive, it may allow you to protect your mate, your young, your territory, your food. So even though you're putting yourself at risk by being aggressive, doing so allows you to protect and maintain the things that you need to survive and reproduce. It can also help you take another's resources. So if you need more resources to raise your own young, then aggression is a route to do that. And that outgoing nature might help you access new resources in new areas. So there are some potential benefits to aggression. And we actually have some interesting ways to compensate for this aggressive behavior, where in especially species that have the ability to remember other individuals that they interact with regularly, they can minimize the required aggression by using something called a dominance hierarchy. You also see it called a pecking order. And so animals will fight once to establish a rank. They determine who is most dominant, basically who can win the fight. And once they've set that position, they know who's in charge whenever they encounter each other. I like the version of this as pecking order, because you see this a lot of times in birds, where the dominant bird is the one that can fight all of the others, so they are the ones who are in charge. And if you look at a bird feeder, the dominant bird gets to sit and eat on the bird feeder by themselves. If a subordinate bird, one of the non-dominant birds, is on the feeder, and a dominant bird comes over, they can chase that bird away so that the dominant gets to eat. And there's no fight, usually. There isn't a confrontation. The bird just knows to get out of the way because that is the dominant bird and they could beat me up if they wanted to, so let's avoid that fight. So these hierarchies allow you to establish who would win in a fight to avoid actually having to fight every single time, which is a pretty good approach. And then at the very, very end here, we just have 3 points that the textbook focuses on very briefly about some of the negative thought pitfalls that people tend to fall into when we talk about genetics, especially in terms of genetics and evolution as it relates to humans. So the first of these problems is the idea of genetic determinism. So people have this false idea that the effects of our genes are concrete and unchangeable. So if there's a gene that's related to aggression, a lot of people look at that and say, oh, well, your genes say you're going to be aggressive, then you're going to be aggressive. But what we've learned as of now is that there's a big interaction between genes and environment, and your genes aren't really determining anything. They're really just predisposing you towards something, and then your environment decides if that's actually going to happen or not. So we shouldn't focus on this idea of the genes are the whole picture. We really need to consider the whole environmental impact. We really want to look at the whole picture, not just the genetic side of things. Our next thought pitfall is this idea of social Darwinism. And this is the false idea that those who are at the top of a social hierarchy are the best. So confusing some of the things that we've talked about in terms of the environment and nature and out in the real world, I guess we can say, where, say, a dominant individual is the dominant because they're the best. Some people apply that idea to humans, but view it as the social hierarchy is that indication of best. So this is the idea of survival of the fittest, sometimes with the idea that the less fit need to go, but they're confusing fitness with wealth or social status. So a lot of times people who have social status don't necessarily have that because of their genetics or anything to do with their physical traits, which is a lot of what evolution and natural selection are dealing with. But they'll assume that their social standings that they've received through either family inheritance or something like that has deemed that they are superior to others. But in terms of genetics, that's not really giving you any support for that flawed idea. Our discussion of survival of the fittest and dominance hierarchies and things like that are all based on physical traits and genetic traits and really don't have anything to do with social structure. So the two ideas shouldn't be confounded like that. And then the last one is kind of an interesting one, where people have this idea that if a trait has come about because of evolution, that it must be good. But those adaptations, those things that have evolved because of natural selection, aren't always beneficial. At the very beginning, we talked about the idea of you've evolved to survive in a desert environment. And so you have this adaptation that allows you to get by with very little water. That's only beneficial in a desert environment. If you move to the other side of the country and all of a sudden you're in rainy Nova Scotia, now that ability to survive with minimal water is unhelpful. So that adaptation is no longer adaptive. It's no longer helping you in that new environment. And so we have to keep in mind that these traits, these adaptations happen in very specific environments and aren't universally good. So we have to adjust how we think about some of these things. So hopefully that helps reframe some of the ideas that we've talked about all throughout this chapter.